Liz Burke is a speech and language pathologist. She taught graduate students at UConn in speech and language pathology for quite a long time, and eventually opened her own practice privately. She has presented tonight's program at various adult learning and other private groups around the area. And she got interested in this topic, secrets and spies, partly because of her volunteer work here with us at the Historical Society. She's a longtime volunteer with us, and she particularly likes to work in our education and field trip programs. And that kind of got her really interested in this topic, and so she did a lot of research on her own, and has decided to share it with people around the area, but particularly here. We were able to coerce her into coming in and doing it tonight. These days she's serving as the board vice president as well. So please welcome Liz Burke.
Thanks very much. I'm so glad that you came to hear this. This is a wonderful story. And the more I learn about this story, the more excited that I find it. So we'll just get started. Returning to England after the Revolutionary War, London's spy master in the colonies, Major George Beckwith, remarked bitterly, "George Washington didn't outfight the British, he outspied us." George Washington had to find some way to combat the British. According to the author Joseph Ellis, the London government had developed during the course of the 18th century the most powerful and efficient machine for waging war in the world, fully capable of projecting and sustaining its power almost indefinitely. George Washington wrote after the war, "It won't be believed that a force as great as Great Britain has employed in this country for 8 years could be baffled by numbers infinitely less, composed of men often half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experiencing at times every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing." Our soldiers really suffered, and it was a very different army from what the British had. George Washington learned about the need for spying from his humiliating defeat in the French and Indian Wars. He said, "There is nothing more necessary than good intelligence to frustrate a designing enemy, and nothing that requires greater pains to obtain." He knew that to win American independence from England, he had to outsmart the British. But the problem was the colonists lacked food, we lacked money, we lacked medical supplies, we lacked weapons, and we lacked training. The English army had 32,000 soldiers. We never had this, but the number was 23,000. We had so fewer than that. They had the largest navy in the world. We had a much smaller navy. They had a huge war chest. We had a lot less money. They had bases in Canada. They had alliances with the Native Americans. They had a body of people to recruit from that was 3 times as large as the colonists. And a third of the colonists living here were still loyal to the king. What we had were colonists eager for independence, colonists who fought with guerrilla tactics, people who knew the countryside, they were good marksmen, and the patriots were better organized in the colonies than the loyalists in the colonies were. But it was interesting because it was also a time of a total different outlook. The British were very formal. They believed in lining up. They believed in a certain kind of warfare with rules, and the colonists didn't. Spying was going to be essential, and throughout the war, George Washington developed an elaborate system of misinformation, spying, and deception that was really remarkable. Although 23,000 troops is an estimate for America, it may have been much closer to 17,000, and always a quarter of those 17,000 were out because of illness. One of the things that they discovered is that there was a huge smallpox outbreak at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and so many soldiers were out with smallpox. And this is an enlistment notice, and I won't read it all to you, but it says that there will be a bounty of $12, an annual and fully sufficient supply of good and handsome clothing, a daily allowance of large and ample ration of provisions, together with $60 a year in gold and silver money on account of pay, the whole of which the soldier may lay up for himself and his friends for his proper sustenance. But in reality, that wasn't the case at all. The soldiers suffered terribly with rarely enough clothing. The soldiers, in many instances, were described in terms of near nakedness and no payment. One soldier, Nathan Plum Martin, whose memoir is available, was paid one time throughout the entire duration of the Revolutionary War. Washington struggled constantly with desertion, lack of support for the troops from the Continental Congress, and lack of trained men. This was in contrast to the Europeans, who had a very regimented battle style and well-fed troops. In 1776, Washington wanted a group of volunteers who could gather intelligence by water or by land, by night or by day. And according to the author Paul Misenik, 18th century spies received little, if any, training, so they developed their techniques on their own. They were often alone and deep within enemy territory, and their survival depended on their quick wits, their composure, and their ability to handle extreme pressure. Some successfully evaded capture while others didn't, and then sometimes the difference between success and failure was razor thin and just simply determined by luck. Thomas Knowlton has his statue at the Connecticut State Capitol. And in 1776, Thomas Knowlton from Ashford, Connecticut, was ordered by George Washington to select a group of men from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts to carry out reconnaissance missions. Knowlton's Rangers were the first official spies, and on September 26, 1776, in the Battle of Harlem Heights, he was killed. And the gallant and brave Colonel Knowlton would have been an honor to any country, having fallen gloriously for his country, Washington said. And then in 1995, the Military Intelligence Corps Association established the Knowlton Award. Now, Nathan Hale was the first man to volunteer with the Knowlton Rangers. And I think it's really important to remember Nathan Hale was 21 years old. In 2000, this is the amazing thing about history. In the year 2000, the Consider Tiffany family, originally from Barkhamsted, donated to the Library of Congress a memoir from their ancestor that told what we believe is the true story of what happened to Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale was trained under Thomas Knowlton. He had no spy experience, and he's believed to have disguised himself as a Dutch schoolmaster in New York City. It's unlikely that he knew Dutch. And the other interesting thing about it is spying was considered ungentlemanly. It was considered kind of like breaking that formal rule of lining up in rows and wearing the black red uniform. So now you're turning into a sneak. And so spying wasn't considered honorable. And at heart, I believe Nathan Hale was a gentleman. This is a drawing of Washington meeting with Hale to go over maps for spying in New York. It's believed that they met 2 or 3 times. Although he was a brave and fine man from all reports, it's undeniable that he was a very poor, untrained spy. He was captured and hung within a week on September 22nd, 1776. A British guard wrote in his memoirs, Captain Hale entered. He was calm and bore himself with gentle dignity in the consciousness of rectitude and high intentions. He asked for writing materials, which I furnished him. He wrote 2 letters, one to his mother and one to a brother officer. He was shortly after summoned to the gallows, but a few persons were around him, yet his characteristic dying words were remembered. He said, I only regret but that I have one life to lose for my country. And then his head, Thomas Knowlton, was killed within that same week. And that I only regret is a line from a play that was very popular at that time. So that may not have been what he said. We don't know exactly what he said, but that famous line may be questionable. Now, in 2015, the Journal of the American Revolution came out with 9 rules for spying. And so let's take a look at them. You have to have an inherent deceptive trait. You gotta be a little on the sneaky side. Don't attract attention. Blend in. Travel with forged papers under a cover alias. Treat your surveillance area as enemy territory. Assume Murphy's Law that what can go wrong will go wrong and abort the mission if necessary. Don't jeopardize your mission. Know when to get out. Assume no one is your friend. Guard against your own weaknesses and safeguard your notes using an unbreakable code in a form instantly discarded. Now, I apologize for this slide, it's so big, but I wanted to take these rules, and now let's see what happened to Nathan Hale. Have an inherent deceptive trait. We know that Hale was naive, open, and straightforward. He followed the life and rules of a gentleman. Don't attract attention. Nathan Hale was unusually tall for his time, over 6 feet tall, and he had noticeable scars on his forehead and his right cheek from a gunpowder flash burn. He had light blue eyes and a long ponytail almost to his waist, and apparently he was very good looking, so he stood out. Travel with your forged papers under a cover alias. He carried his Yale diploma with him, with his name written in ink. Treat your surveillance area as enemy territory. Nathan Hale had been in New York before, and his cousin, Samuel Hale, worked there for General Howe. So it's very possible that he was recognized. Assume Murphy's Law that what can go wrong will go wrong and abort the mission. The day before, New York had an enormous fire, a conflagration really. 1,000 buildings were burned in the fire. And so the British and local residents were all on the lookout for who started the fire. And here's this tall, handsome guy walking around. Don't jeopardize your mission. Know when to get out. He apparently drew attention by asking a lot of questions about who was loyal to America. Assume no one is your friend. And this is a really interesting part. Hale was arrested by the ruthless British Major Robert Rogers. And I think if there's a bad guy in history and the American Revolution, Robert Rogers probably ranks right up there. He wanted to work for Washington, and Washington didn't want him. And so he worked for the British, and I think he was strictly a guy that was doing it for money. And he had been alerted about Hale being in a tavern. So Robert Rogers went into the tavern dressed in civilian clothes, and he sat down with him and befriended him, bought him drinks, pretended to be a patriot, and Nathan Hale poured out the story of his mission. And over drinks, it all came out. Guard against your own weaknesses. Although Nathan Hale was pious and deeply religious, he liked to drink, and Rogers may have helped him drink too much in order to get him to talk. So what Rogers did was Nathan Hale poured out the whole story, and then Rogers said, let's get back together in the morning, I'll be back for breakfast. And he came back for breakfast, and as they were eating, the building was surrounded by the guards and he was arrested. Safeguard your notes. using an unbreakable code in a form instantly discarded. Well, Nathan Hale had written his notes in Latin, but unfortunately, many of the British were well educated and understood it very quickly. And I think the point that I feel strongly about Nathan Hale is that I think he was a really good guy. I think he was a brave and noble 21-year-old young man who just was underprepared for the mission. He was beloved by his friends, 21 years old. Supposedly, at his hanging, he asked for the clergy, and the British said no. He asked for a Bible, and was again denied. And many accounts of the hanging state that Hale was composed and that he spoke eloquently. And then this other general talked about how he said he was prepared to meet death in whatever shape it might appear. But we know that his body was left to hang for, I think, several days, and then buried in an unmarked grave that has never been discovered. And through the years, he's been honored through stamps, statues, comic books, and he is the Connecticut state hero. His home is in Coventry, Connecticut. And this is the considered Tiffany Dip memoir that was donated to the Library of Congress in 2000. The page on the left tells the story of his capture. In 1777, it looked as if the American colonies were losing against the British. The Continental Army had had to evacuate from Philadelphia, and Great Britain had control of New York City's port. In February of 1777, Washington wrote to Nathaniel Sackett with a proposal to establish a spy network. An article in the National Geographic calls this the letter that won the American Revolution. Washington offered to pay him $50 from his own pocket per month. Most of Sackett's agents failed, and he was fired within 6 months. But the man who followed him was Benjamin Talmadge, and that made all the difference, and we'll hear more about him later. So after Hale died, Washington decided to use civilians to help him spy, because they could easily blend in with the population, doing everyday jobs. And one such man was John Honeyman, and he was a farmer and a meat vendor to the British troops. Civilians could pretend to be loyalists and report what they saw and they heard as they moved and worked among the British. Although George Washington did know John Honeyman, he didn't know many of the spies in his network, because the fewer people that knew each other, the safer they were, because if they were captured and tortured, they might reveal names that otherwise they wouldn't. So pushing a cart like this, Honeyman would buy cattle, sell meat, and eavesdrop while engaging with the soldiers as he moved among them. He was also noting troop sizes, the arms they had, the people that were there, all information that he could report back. And Washington then had him so-called arrested and brought to him. Honeyman then told him everything he had learned, and then George Washington arranged for him to escape. And during his travels, Honeyman learned that the British planned a Christmas celebration without sentries. There was also one of those old world army rules that armies didn't fight in the wintertime. So from Honeyman's information, Washington led his troops across the Delaware River on December 26, 1776, and captured the Hessian troops in Trenton. It was a very needed victory, and only 4 patriots were wounded. Now, here's the complication. This is the frustrating thing about history. While John Honeyman's story is reported everywhere, any book you look at, an article on the CIA website points out that none of the story may be true. Almost 250 years have passed, and the lines between fact and fiction have dimmed. So, in October of 1778, Washington asked Benjamin Talmadge, he followed the other guy to organize a spy group. And he was to bring intelligence from British-controlled New York to the Continental Army. He was a classmate of Nathan Hale, and until 1776, superintendent of Wethersfield High School. I can't quite visualize what that was like, but the spy ring had 2 key members. Abraham Woodhull, who was 26, and he was known as Samuel Coulter Sr., and Robert Townsend, who was 22, and he was known as Samuel Coulter Jr. Now, again, an amazing fact, they didn't know about this spy ring until 1930. And a man named Morton Pennypacker is the man who discovered the story. It's all been so hidden. Benjamin Talmadge's memoir alluded to special missions he completed for George Washington, but he never discussed them openly. The name Culper came from the town of Culpeper, Virginia. Robert Townsend was 22, and he was a Quaker coffee shop owner, and he was a society reporter. He posed as a loyalist, and he wrote many, many pro-British articles in newspapers. He attended social gatherings, and he listened. He had become a patriot after reading Thomas Paine, and he chose to volunteer for a post that didn't require him to fight. He was also deeply embittered by the way the British had treated his family in Oyster Bay, New York, taking over their home and using it as they pleased, and also destroying his father's apple orchard. And Robert Townsend would relay his information to Austin Rowe, who was a tavern operator, who carried the information to Seatocket, Long Island, a distance of 55 miles. Now this is really complicated, so I'm going to try to show you this. So here's Robert Townsend in New York, and he would be gathering information about the British troops and movements. And he would then give the information to Austin Rowe. Austin Rowe owned a tavern in Seatocket, but he would be in New York City gathering supplies. The British never suspected him because it looked like he was taking care of business. He would then bring the information to a field in Seatocket here called the Dead Drop. He would leave something in a field, then a message, then Anna Smith Strong, who lived there, would hang her black petticoat, hanging over there, and a corresponding number of handkerchiefs on her clothesline to tell the people, to Caleb Brewster, the whaleboat operator, where in Long Island Sound the message was waiting. He would then take the information across to Benjamin Talmadge in Fairfield, who would take it on to George Washington in New Jersey. Isn't that a great story?
It's amazing. When you think of today's society, you want to know.
And all on horseback. I mean, it's unbelievable. Austin Rowe, the tavern keeper in his late 20s, appeared to the British as a British merchant. He remained undetected for the entire war. And after the war, George Washington visited his tavern and the two men talked. It may have been the first time that they met. He died in 1830, and he's been called the Paul Revere of Long Island. And this is a picture of him painting, riding from the ferry to Seatocket. At the end of the war, Caleb Brewster, the sea captain, was shot through the chest, and he suffered from the injuries for the rest of his life. This is a letter George Washington wrote that helped him establish a pension. I certify that in the year 1778, whilst the American army lay at the White Plains, it became necessary to station an officer and a few men on the Sound to keep open a communication with the city of New York by the way of Long Island for the purpose of my secret correspondence. The Captain Lieutenant Brewster of the 2nd Regiment of Artillery was chosen for this service. The circumstances made it necessary for him to continue until the close of the war, and as far as I know or believe, that he conducted the business with fidelity, judgment, and bravery, having received a wound whilst on that duty, for which I am informed he is not yet recovered. Washington's spying was dangerous and exciting as anything we see in a James Bond movie. In many ways, the spying was more dangerous because communications were poor, distances long, and the countryside often rugged. The personal sacrifices and risks these people took is astonishing. And in fiction, James Bond was 007. In reality, George Washington was 7-11. We know that people tried to murder or kidnap George Washington throughout the entire Revolutionary War. And separating fact and fiction is hard. Again, as we noticed with John Honeyman, almost 250 years have passed and records have been lost. One story that we're not sure is true is about the green peas. George Washington apparently loved a bowl of green peas. He went to Fraunces Tavern in New York, which still exists today, with his staff. His bodyguard, Thomas Hickey, was with him, and Thomas Hickey, it said, was enamored with Phoebe Fraunces, the tavern owner's daughter. Thomas, secretly a British loyalist, now he's George Washington's aide, but he's really a loyalist, told Phoebe of his plan to poison George Washington using a highly toxic poison called Paris green. Phoebe is said to have whispered something to George Washington, such as, "Don't eat it, or it's poisoned," because George Washington threw the peas out of the window, and they watched the chickens who ate them die. Now, that story is, again, everywhere, and it's speculation. They're not sure that story is true. But what they are absolutely true about is that on the morning of June 28, 1776, just days before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the largest crowd to watch a public execution, 20,000 people, watched Thomas Hickey, George Washington's aide, hanged. George had sent a message to both the British and other traitors, and Thomas was involved in a very elaborate plot to kill George Washington. Washington wanted invisible ink, and he wrote, "It's in my power, I believe, to procure a liquid, which nothing but a counter liquid rubbed over the page afterwards can make legible." John Jay's brother was a doctor and an amateur chemist, and he helped to develop the ink that would disappear when written between the lines of a letter. A revealing agent was then rubbed on. Washington developed an extensive code system based on words selected from the dictionary that were then numbered. Messages were written in numbers from 1 to 764. So Washington was 711, attack was 38, the British was 72. And this is a letter, I know it's not too clear, written in that code. And then this is the dictionary. This is the corresponding word. It's interesting that 187 is glorious. So it's a little antiquated. We also had hidden letters, and we have one up there that I'll show you later. On one day, you would receive a letter. The following day, you would receive the cutout called the mask. And you would put the mask over the letter and read the real message. And so what I've done here is spaced and highlighted. But it says, "Sir William Howe is gone to Chesapeake Bay with the greater part of the army. I hear he has landed, but I'm not certain. I'm left to command here with too small a force to make any effectual diversion in your favor." And so when you could read the letter logically, but the mask told you the real meaning. Very cool. Messages were also hidden in quill pens. Messages were hidden in everything. And so I think as creative as you can be in thinking of where could I hide a message, they hid messages. These are actual 2 messages that were hidden in quill pens from 1777. Messages were hidden in the waistbands of pants. Dr. Benjamin Church, who was, we thought, a noted son of liberty, but was actually a traitor, passed information to British General Gage using waistbands. And there were all kinds of coded messages. This is such a basic coded message. This would never have really made it. But the word at the bottom in that strange shape says Washington. And how it worked. Okay, so you go with this shape and you put a dot in the middle because W's in the middle. That's Washington. You go with that shape A is on the left, so the dot is on the left, and that spells Washington. Jefferson devised the wheel cipher. Now, his wheel cipher actually had 36 rotating wheels. And he actually he worked on it all through the Revolution, but he actually began to use it when he was serving as Secretary of State under President George Washington. And during the war, he used codes to send messages because letters were constantly intercepted, unsealed, read, and resealed. And it's a fascinating spy tool. This system was used by the Army and other military services from 1922 until the beginning of World War II. Many objects were used to hide secret messages. Here a message is sticking out of the tip of a powder horn. Messages were also hidden in double-bottomed canteens. This is an image from World War II, but shoes have long been used in spying. Messages were hidden inside heels or inside the shoe itself. They were hidden in coats, hidden pockets, gloves, you name it. Wherever you could hide a message, they were hidden. And there was a young man named John LaGrange Mercereau, who stayed on Staten Island when the others had fled from the British. He had a defective right arm, so he couldn't even hold a musket. And he kind of allowed himself to be underestimated. But it was said that he would cross the water in New Jersey with his papers in a bottle towed behind the little boat that he was in. And if he was captured, all he had to do was cut the cord. And with a signal of lights, he would tell his compatriots in New Jersey where the information had been hidden. And he did successful espionage for 18 months. Then we had eavesdropping. And eavesdropping was very effectively done by women, enslaved people, and servants. And if you wanted to describe it most succinctly, they were overlooked and underestimated. Eavesdropping became a crucial part of George Washington's spy arsenal. Women, enslaved people, and servants were ever present, and they could eavesdrop. They were always in the background, and although they were considered insignificant, they played a huge role in altering the course of the Revolutionary War. One common tactic that we mentioned earlier was that the British would take over people's homes and use them for their own purposes. And in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which made the colonies have to feed and house the soldiers. Thomas Jefferson was so upset about it, he listed it as a grievance in the Declaration of Independence. And James Madison wrote the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights to guarantee that the federal government couldn't force local governments to house U.S. soldiers. But then the British commandeered the home of Lydia Darrah in Philadelphia, and she persuaded them to let her keep her bedrooms and part of her house. This allowed her, as well as others in similar situations, to observe and eavesdrop on the British. As the British officers ate and drank too much, the servants and enslaved people were waiting on them and overhearing everything. And as they drank more and talked more, they revealed more. An Irish immigrant and Quaker, Lydia Darrah, lived across the street from General Howe's headquarters in Philadelphia, and they held a secret meeting in her house on December 2nd, 1777, where they discussed attacking the Patriots in White Marsh the next day. Lydia hid in the closet and eavesdropped, and then, on the pretext of getting flour, went to the mill, made her way to the Rising Sun Tavern, where she handed Colonel Boudinot her little tiny needlebook, which contained a message about the attack. This gave Washington the warning that he needed. Lydia's daughter published this story in 1827, and people questioned its accuracy until Colonel Boudinot's memoirs were published in 1909 and corroborated what had happened. Obviously, there wouldn't have been plastic scissors in there, but women carried these little needle books with them, and they had thread and buttons. The message inside her needle book read, General Howe going out with 5,000 men, 13 cannon, and 11 boats on wheels. Lydia was a midwife. She raised 5 children, 4 died in infancy. In June of 1778, the British left Philadelphia and she was able to be reunited with her children. In 1783, her husband died and she ran a store until her death in 1789. During that time, people made clothes with cloth-covered buttons, and one story says that when Lydia Darrah eavesdropped on the British officers, she wrote the messages on small pieces of paper, hid them inside the covered buttons, sewed them to her 14-year-old son's jacket, and sent him off to his brothers, where the messages were then read. And this is from Colonel Goodno's memoir. I dined at a small post at the Rising Sun Tavern, about 3 miles from the city. After dinner, a little poor-looking, insignificant old woman came in and solicited leave to go to the country to buy some flour. While we were asking some questions, she walked up to me and put into my hands a dirty old needlebook with small pockets in it. Surprised at this, I told her to return she should have an answer, and on opening the needlebook, I couldn't find anything until I got to the last pocket, where I found a piece of paper rolled up in the form of a pipe stem. On unrolling it, I found that General Howe was coming out the next morning with 5,000 men, 13 pieces of cannon, baggage wagons, and 11 boats on wagon wheels. On comparing this with other information, I found it true and immediately rode to headquarters. Now we have Hercules Milligan, who has been so famous from the musical Hamilton. He came at 36 from Ireland, and he was an elite tailor in New York City to wealthy New Yorkers and British officers. Although he had a staff of tailors, he personally greeted his clients, he measured them himself, and he formed relationships with his customers. He was perceived as an absolute loyalist, but he secretly belonged to the Sons of Liberty. And he gathered information from conversations with the officers. One of the things he did was ask, well, when do you need your uniform? And if they all said, oh, gotta have it Thursday. Something's up for Friday or Thursday night. Hamilton, he also took in Alexander Hamilton, and he influenced his thinking greatly in terms of liberty. Mulligan had an enslaved man, Cato, who also was very involved in spying. He carried secret messages and clothing he delivered, and twice he saved George Washington's life from kidnappings. Hercules Mulligan had appeared to be so much a loyalist that at the end of the Revolutionary War, he was scared to death he was going to be tarred and feathered. And so following the parade of evacuation in 1783, Washington came to his shop, ate with him, and bought items. Mulligan had a sign in his shop after that read, "Clothier to General Washington." He died at the age of 85, and he's buried beside Alexander Hamilton. Cato's fate is lost to history. We don't know what happened, but we do know that Hamilton and Mulligan became 2 of the founders of the Manumission Society, which was an abolitionist group, and so we hope that he was freed. Washington also recruited Mom Rinker to spy, and this is another one of those kind of iffy stories. It's everywhere. It's possibly true. She and her husband ran the Buck Tavern in Germantown, which the British commandeered, sending her husband away. And she was forced to stay and serve the troops, which she did, while she also served them strong drinks. She then eavesdropped and wrote down everything she heard on pieces of paper, that she wrapped around rocks and hid in skeins of wool. She would then sit on a high rock and knit, while also observing troop movements down below. She would then allow the skein to fall over the side of the hill, and the Green Mountain Boys would pick it up and take it to George Washington. And it's said that her information was vital to the Battle of Germantown. We also had double agents in the war, and James Armistead Lafayette was an enslaved man and a double agent, and he may have been the single greatest spy of the Revolutionary War. He posed as a runaway spy working for the British, but he actually aided Lafayette. His work helped the Patriots win the Battle of Yorktown, and unbelievably, he was forced to return to slavery at the end of the war. But with the help of Lafayette, he was freed in 1787. He later owned land, and he died in 1830. And Lafayette in 1784 wrote a letter of commendation for him, and this is the letter. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential service to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with important missions I gave him, and appears to be entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. And it's said that when Lafayette came back to America 40 years after the war was over, he came back for this triumphant visit, and there were many parades and things, and he spotted James in the crowd. He stopped the parade, and the two men embraced. The names of black soldiers who fought in the Revolution are lost to history. In some cases, we have first names, but the records are poor or non-existent for many. We know that they fought for freedom, not just for a new nation, but for themselves, with the hope that if they fought, they would be allowed to be free men. And the first black spy may have been Quaco in Newport, Rhode Island, employed in the kitchen of a Mr. Overing. Quaco reported on British General Richard Prescott, who later was captured by Patriot troops. He petitioned the Rhode Island General Assembly to change his status from enslaved to free, and they did so in 1782. Saul Matthews gathered crucial information on Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown. Virginia Militia Colonel Josiah Parker stated that he deserved the applause of the country for what he did. The Virginia Assembly again refused to grant us freedom for more than a decade, finally doing so in 1792. In 1783, the South Carolina legislature granted Antigua, his wife Hagar, and their child freedom for the intelligence he gathered about South Carolina Governor John Rutledge. Windsor Historical Society's own librarian, Michelle Tom, has been researching the black soldiers from Windsor who served. And this is a plaque at the Kings Mountain battlefield in North Carolina that recognizes black soldiers who fought there. And my family is related to this area, and I've been to that battlefield a number of times, and this plaque just went up, and don't you think it's just about time? We had secret signals, and I showed you the petticoat and the handkerchiefs. Anna Strong was the mother of 9 children, and her husband was captured by the British and thrown into the hold of a ship where he was starving to death. The holds of the British prison ships have been compared to the concentration camps of World War II. There was no food, or at best spoiled food, no fresh water or air. Lice and vermin abounded, as well as raging illness, including typhoid and smallpox. And so what she did was hang out the skirt, the petticoat, and the handkerchiefs. The British knew there was a spy, and they never could figure it out. It was so risky for one spy to know another that many never met. If interrogated or tortured by the British, they might break. So the dead drop approach was very common, and it's where someone would get a message and leave it somewhere. And then another person would get a message, there's a message over there, go get it. And so the two spies never met. Messages were hidden in the holes of trees, under rocks. They were sent by changes in the way the fence poles were lined up, and by opened or closed windows, just to name a few. And in 1775, in Cambridge, George Washington discovered that they were so low on gunpowder that he only had enough ammunition for each one of his men to have 9 shots. So he said, I've got to deceive these people. So he had all the gun barrels filled with sand, and placed very prominently where the British could see them, and it fooled the British into thinking that we were well supplied. Washington made a terrible mistake, and it related to his teeth. He started losing his teeth in his 20s, and I just read again last night that by the time he died, he had one tooth. Despite popular belief, his dentures weren't made of wood. He owned many sets, and they were made from gold, ivory, lead, human, and animal teeth, and they had springs and bolts. He was buried with a set of dentures made by his favorite dentist, John Greenwood. And he wrote this letter from New Windsor in May 29, 1781. Sir, a day or two ago I requested Colonel Harrison to apply to you for a pair of pincers to fasten the wire on my teeth. I hope you furnished him with them. I now wish you would send me one of your scrapers, as my teeth stand in need of cleaning, and I have little prospect of being in Philadelphia soon. It will come very safe by the post, and in return, the money shall be sent so soon as I know the cost of it. I am your very humble servant, George Washington. The mistake was that the British intercepted the letter, which then identified Washington's location, New Windsor, and also the name of his dentist, which placed him at risk with the British. But the other thing was he was an enormous embarrassment for him. He was proud, he didn't like losing his teeth, and it was something that the British could make fun of him for, and he was very embarrassed by it. Now I just want to talk a little bit about British spies. We had Anna Bates, and Anna Bates was known as Mrs. Barnes. We don't know what she wore on her clothes. This was the real fancy Anna Bates on the right. That was peddler Mrs. Barnes on the left. And we know that she moved among the American troops peddling threads. And she wandered through the American encampments, but she was gathering information. She was one of the most successful British spies of the war, and she actually entered into Washington's headquarters several times. She returned to England in 1781, where her husband abandoned her, and she later appealed to the British government for a small pension for her spying, and she got it. And Anna Bates was unbelievably successful, and just as a little side note, Jim Welch, who is in the American Historical Society, recommended I read the book The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. And it was written just 40 years after the close of the Revolutionary War. And so it's very accurate in terms of the recent history. John Andre was a major in the British Army, and he was head of the British Secret Service in America. He was handsome, he was well educated, he could speak 4 languages. He wrote poetry, and he was an accomplished artist. He was James Bond. He was everything about this guy, he was so charming. And he met the beautiful Peggy Shippen, who was the wife of Benedict Arnold, and they became friends. And 1 month after marrying Peggy Shippen, who was 20 years younger than he was, Benedict Arnold reached out to Andre, offering to sell West Point. Andre was captured by 3 Continental Army soldiers in 1789, and the papers in his boot confirmed that Benedict Arnold was a traitor and planned to surrender the fort at West Point. And this is a copy of the letter from Benedict Arnold offering to sell West Point for 20,000 pounds. It's said that George Washington cried when he learned about Benedict Arnold. In the book Washington by Ron Charnow, which I have up there, he says, despite a healthy dose of cynicism about most people, Washington missed all the warning signs about Benedict Arnold. Word had reached Arnold that Andre had been captured, and he fled. Now, the story is amazing because George Washington and the Marquis Lafayette were visiting West Point the day that Benedict Arnold found out Andre had been captured, which meant he was done for. And so Benedict Arnold fled, but what happened was his wife, the beautiful Peggy Shippen, put on a show. And she put on a show that completely took Washington and Lafayette's gentleman behavior by surprise. They were completely fooled. She was upstairs and she started crying hysterically. And they finally went up. They were supposed to have a meal. Arnold hasn't showed up. They can't quite figure out. The other thing that was wrong was that when Washington got to West Point, he's looking for it to be in good shape because Arnold was supposed to have been fortifying it, and it's a mess, and he can't figure out what's happened. And then Peggy Shippen is crying and crying, and they go upstairs, and her clothes are falling off, and she's nursing her baby, and she's screaming hysterically that there are hot spears on her head. She's ranting and raving. Washington and Lafayette are completely taken in by it. They feel so sorry for her. She's a beautiful woman, but she's half naked, and they're totally taken in by it. They go back down for dinner, and suddenly she sort of calms down. Well, he's long gone. And he fled, and she was part of the plan. So let me get this going again here. Let's see. Let's try that. See if that will do it there. This is a picture of Peggy Shippen, quite the hairstyle, that was drawn by John Andre. Historians don't think that John Andre had a romance with her, but they do know that she inserted secret coded ciphers into her letters, and this is one of those letters. She was very confident that no one would read the letters of the wife of a general. She eventually was welcomed back to England by the King and Queen. Benedict Arnold went on. He failed in several businesses in England and Canada, and he died in 1801. Washington could never catch him. This is a self-portrait that John Andre, remember, he's head of the British Secret Service in America. He drew this the night before he was executed, and this drawing is at Yale University. Now, in the formal way of the European approach, the firing squad was a noble way for an English officer to die. Hanging was considered crude and a disgrace. So John Andre asked to be shot by the firing squad, and Washington had him hung. A surgeon standing nearby left a detailed account of the hanging, and he said that Andre tied the handkerchief around his own eyes and placed the noose around his own neck. Washington boycotted the execution. Ron Chernow said, for Washington, who never shrank from doing the right thing, however hard or unpopular, it was a lonely moment of leadership. Benjamin Talmadge wrote, now remember, Benjamin Talmadge is the head of a covert spy ring, and he wrote in his memoirs, from the time of his being brought back to our headquarters to the day of his execution, I became so deeply attached to Major Andre that I can remember no instance where my affections were so fully absorbed in any man. When I saw him swinging under the gibbet, it seemed to me as if I couldn't support it. All the spectators seemed similarly affected. Okay, who's this up? I'm sorry. Let's see here. Make that go. I was in Westminster Abbey in April in London, and this is the top part of John Andre's tomb, and this is the bottom. And it talks about his serving in America, age 29, universally beloved and esteemed by the army in which he served, and lamented even by his foes. His gracious sovereign, King George III, has ordered this monument to be erected. And one of the things about this that's interesting is that John Andre was a gentleman, and he was a highly educated gentleman, and it kind of looks like one of the reasons they had such a difficult time hanging him is because he wasn't a crude man. He was a highly educated man, kind of like their background, and it was harder for them to hang him than it would have been for someone who was maybe from a lower class. Now, the first Surgeon General of the United States and a member of the Sons of Liberty was Dr. Benjamin Church. He was the first doctor on the scene of the Boston Massacre. He did patriotic writings, and he'd been a British spy since 1772. He was tried by Washington, imprisoned, became ill, was paroled, and sent to the West Indies, and his ship was lost at sea. Now, in closing, I want to talk about two people from Windsor. I want to talk about Daniel Bissell. He was born in 1754. He enlisted in 1775 in Connecticut's 8th Regiment. He fought at Germantown, and he spent the horrifying winter at Valley Forge. He served at the Battle of White Plains and Trenton, and he was wounded at the Battle of Monmouth. In 1781, George Washington asked him to go behind enemy lines to spy on the British in New York. He was 27 years old. And the thing about accepting this job was that he would be listed as a deserter and considered a disgrace by everyone, including fellow soldiers, friends, and family. And I just put in the bottom, that was a desertion notice where any person who shall stop the said deserter shall have a reward of $4 and all charges paid. Deserters were disgraceful. And tragically, news could travel so slowly that a man's reputation could be ruined before the truth of his spying was ever revealed. So Daniel Bissell went into New York with 2 changes of clothing so he would look like a deserter. But he soon became just extremely ill, and he was put into a British hospital and considered a British soldier, and he languished there for several months, cold and covered in lice. He finally recovered and became a quartermaster and served under Benedict Arnold's Loyal Americans as a spy. He escaped in 1782, and he was taken in chains to George Washington. He then drew detailed maps of the troops and fortifications that are in Washington's library, papers at the Library of Congress, and that's one of the maps that he drew of the fort. Washington offered to relieve him of duty, because he was still not in good health, but he declined and served until May of 1783. He was one of 3 recipients of the Badge of Merit, a new badge designed by Washington for singularly meritorious action. European armies had no such decoration or honor for lower ranks, and the badge was worn above the left breast, and it would give you admission to wherever you wanted to go. His badge was destroyed in a house fire in Ontario, New York in 1813. He had lifelong health problems, probably from his illness during the mission. He died on August 5th, 1824, at 79 years of age, and his tombstone reads, "He had the confidence of Washington and served under him." But then years later, his family told the rest of the story. This is what they said he said. Daniel escaped the British by pretending to chase a pig. He took along a comrade who also wanted to escape, and they brought along a little boy as a blind. They came to a river, and because his comrade couldn't swim, he carried him on his shoulders with the boy swimming beside. Using a stick, which resembled a pistol, Bissell ordered a man in a boat to take them across, no questions asked or answered. They were pursued by British light horse, but they reached a swamp and hid with nothing but their heads out of the water. The boy began to cry, and as the story goes, Bissell said, "I'll drown you in a minute if you make the least noise." Years later, his nieces and nephews said, "I should have done it." After about two hours, the troops and the dogs gave up. Bissell and his colleagues spent the night in trees before getting to Washington's headquarters. And I think it's unclear whether he ever really made it home and whether he ever really was known in Windsor as the great man that he was until much later. The last story isn't about a spy, but it's such a great story, I just had to put it in. God Save the King. And the king, of course, was George III of England. And this is in one of the ancient books of Windsor. The war has as yet fairly commenced, and some of the Tories, of whom there were a few in Windsor, happened one day to come across Elihu Drake, a boy about 8 years old. And partly in earnest and partly as a joke, they endeavored to compel him to say, "God save the king." Failing of success, they tried to intimidate him by threatening him with dunking in the little river. But the boy still stoutly refused. Becoming enraged at this young rebel, they carried their threat into execution, and they thrust him underwater. But as they pulled him out, sputtering and choking, the only explanation which he uttered was the fervent, "God damn the king." Again and again was the little martyr thrust under, but each time the saying, "God damn the king," was all they could extort from him, and they were obliged to release him with many hearty curses for his stubbornness. So as we consider these brave people and the facts of their lives, we sometimes forget the untold stories. Anna Strong had 9 children, and as she hung her petticoats and handkerchiefs, she endangered them all every day if she was caught. Yet, she took the risk. Daniel Bissell faced unimaginable humiliation in Windsor because he was seen as a deserter. He risked his personal reputation for his country, and he knew that many people would never know the truth of what he had endured. All the members of the Culper Spy Ring knew they could face the fate of Nathan Hale, death by hanging, and yet they pursued. Servants and enslaved people who had so little to gain took the risk to help. Against unimaginable odds, their work, combined with so many others, secured us the nation we have today. Thank you.
Thank you.